They never told him why. Ethan Carter had asked, once. The guard hadn't answered, just shoved a stale ration packet through the drop slot, turned, and vanished again into the sterile corridor. That was 36 days ago. He knew, because he'd started marking the days on the corner of his cell wall, using the edge of his boot. It wore the leather down. It didn't matter. Counting kept him anchored. The cold stone, the recycled air that always tasted faintly of antiseptic and rust, the low hum of the force barrier that sealed him in, none of those things had changed. But Ethan had. The first week, he'd paced, measured the cell, 12 paces long, 9 paces wide. The second week, he'd started speaking aloud to keep his voice from vanishing. By the third, he was arguing with the wall, and by the fourth, the wall had won. He wasn't a soldier, not a spy. He had a degree in xenolinguistics and taught third-grade comparative mythologies on Earth before taking the diplomatic post. The Ye-Larn Empire had requested human linguists to assist with translation between border systems. He'd volunteered, believing in the mission, believing in communication, believing that wars didn't start if people just understood each other. The irony made him laugh sometimes. It wasn't a good laugh, more like a cracked plate being dropped down a stairwell. He was sitting on the floor, back against the wall, peeling the label off his ration packet with methodical disinterest when he first saw her. A flicker of movement. Not from the door, not from above. She was just there, standing in the corner like she'd materialized from the shadows. Small, delicate, cloaked in something dark and opulent that shimmered under the dim cell lights. Ethan's breath caught. He blinked hard. Still there. "Okay," he rasped, wincing at how rough his voice had become. "That's new." The girl didn't speak, just stood there. Her eyes were wide, a deep violet so stark they practically glowed. She couldn't have been more than 12 if the Ye-Larn aged the same way humans did. Her face was unreadable. Ethan slowly raised a hand, palm out, then let it fall. "I won't bite," he said, "unless you brought soup. Then I might scream." Nothing. Not a flinch, not even a blink. She moved, finally, gliding to sit cross-legged on the floor just outside the field's edge. Her posture was impossibly composed, eyes fixed on him. Ethan stared. "So, just sitting, huh?" Silence. "Well, fine. I'll just talk then. Been a while since I had an audience." He glanced at the ceiling. "Don't worry, Wall. You're still my #1 fan." The girl didn't react. Still, Ethan felt a weird warmth bloom in his chest, like a dry riverbed seeing clouds for the first time in months. He began with a story, something harmless, a memory about a squirrel on Earth that used to fake injuries to get food from tourists. He exaggerated wildly, throwing in voices and hand gestures. The girl's gaze didn't shift. He kept going. A tale about his cat, Mr. Buttons, and the peanut butter jar incident. He described it in loving detail, the yowling, the kitchen destruction, the deeply betrayed expression once the jar was removed. His voice broke halfway through from the effort. She didn't smile. But she didn't leave either. That night, after she disappeared as soundlessly as she came, Ethan cried for the first time in weeks. Not from fear, from relief. She came back the next day. And the day after that. He never asked her to. He didn't know how she got in. There were no footsteps, no sounds of doors, no guards shouting. One moment, she wasn't there. The next, she was. Ethan learned to keep talking. Stories, jokes, old myths from Earth's ancient cultures. He pantomimed. He drew ridiculous pictures in the dust with his finger. Anything to make her stay. Over time, he began to notice things. She sat closer, her shoulders no longer tensed. Her eyes lingered when he acted out particularly stupid jokes. Once, when he slipped mid-pirouette during a retelling of a failed Ye-Larn gala he'd witnessed years ago, she shifted just slightly, as if suppressing a reaction. He pretended not to notice. But inside, a spark flickered. Still, she never spoke. One afternoon, after she settled in her usual spot, Ethan studied her more closely. Her clothes were finely made, far too ornate for a child wandering prison corridors. Her hands bore faint traces of symbols woven into her cuffs. He'd seen those before. Royal symbols. His mouth went dry. Can I ask you something? He ventured. Her eyes met his. Why don't you talk? He said gently. Can't you even laugh? Now that I think about it, who are you? How did you even get in here? For the first time, her expression changed. Her gaze dropped, her small frame tensed. She shook her head once, rose smoothly, and walked away without looking back. The silence that returned after her departure was different. It wasn't empty, it was punishment. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He replayed every word, every inflection. He shouldn't have asked, should have kept it light. His mind spiraled. He was halfway through debating with the wall over the ethics of interrogating mysterious miners when the drop slot hissed open with his daily ration. He didn't touch it. The next day, she didn't come. Or the next. He stopped talking altogether. On the fourth day, he found himself crouched by the wall, arms wrapped around his knees, head down. I didn't mean to scare you, he said softly to the empty cell. He didn't expect an answer. So when a small shadow once again flickered into view, Ethan jerked his head up so fast he nearly slammed it into the wall. She was back, standing just outside the force field, still silent, still watching. Relief crashed over him like a wave. He laughed a real, messy, tear-filled laugh. And then he started talking again. Not stories this time. Truths. He told her about the diplomatic mission that went wrong, how he'd been accused without trial, how the guards didn't even look him in the eye anymore. He told her about his sister on Mars who loved bad puns and his parents who thought teaching was noble. He told her about being scared, about missing the sky. She listened. Always. Eventually, he leaned his forehead against the wall and exhaled. I don't know why you keep coming, he murmured, but thank you. The next day, when she returned, he met her with a determined grin. All right, he said, dusting off his hands. Today's the day. I swear I'm gonna make you laugh. He dove into the absurd, reenacted an entire human diplomatic dinner where no one had accounted for Larn, digestive systems reacting violently to garlic. He mimicked the horrified silence. The stampede to the facilities. The guy who tried to plug his gills with napkins. Nothing. He threw himself into a mock sword duel with a broomstick he'd stolen during cleaning rotation, pretending it was a ceremonial staff. Recited Shakespeare in a cowboy accent. Sang Earth jingles as though they were battle anthems. Still, nothing. And then, finally, as he stumbled over a retelling of how one Yalarn dignitary had slipped on a polished floor because he didn't understand humans used friction to walk, her lips twitched. Her eyes widened in surprise at herself. And then she laughed. It was sharp, halting, almost startled but unmistakably real. Ethan froze. The sound echoed in the cell like a song never meant to exist. Then came the shouting. The door burst open. 3 guards stormed in, weapons drawn, frantic. One dropped to his knees the moment he saw her. Ethan backed against the wall, confused, disoriented. The princess, one guard whispered, eyes gleaming. She spoke. Ethan looked from the guard to the girl. She stood tall now, spine straight, eyes steady. Her face was still, but her hands were trembling. Wait, she's? Another guard lowered his weapon, voice reverent. Princess Alira, the silent star. Ethan sat down hard. Well, he muttered. That explains the fancy robe. The cell was suddenly too small. Ethan barely had time to process the guards flooding in before 2 of them sank to one knee, heads bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the floor. The third remained standing, shaking, one hand clenched over his chest in a gesture Ethan didn't recognize. Princess Alira hadn't moved. Her hands were still trembling, barely, but her gaze hadn't wavered. She stood between Ethan and the guards, her silence more commanding now than any order barked by a general. I don't understand, Ethan said, trying to stand, but his legs wobbled under him. One of the kneeling guards spoke without looking up. She has not made a sound since the night of the sundering, since the Empress died in her arms. I don't. Ethan looked from him to the girl Alira. That was 10 years ago? She was 2, the guard whispered. Princess Alira took a slow step forward, placing herself just inside the reach of the force barrier's glow. The nearest guard paled visibly. My lady, he murmured, voice thick with emotion, we thought it was permanent. that you had lost your voice forever. She didn't speak. Not again, not yet. But her chin rose, and she turned, lifting one hand slowly toward Ethan. And then, in the silence, she pointed. Directly at him. There was a murmur from the guards, a reverent awe, like they were witnessing prophecy. Ethan, still half crouched against the wall, raised both hands, palms out. Look, if I broke something sacred by making her laugh, I promise it was accidental. I just told her about slipping Yalarn ambassadors. No, said the kneeling guard, looking up now. You healed something sacred. The next hour blurred. Ethan was ordered gently out of the cell. His legs nearly gave out twice, and one of the guards offered an arm. He was too dazed to protest. They didn't chain him, didn't force him, just escorted him down corridors that hadn't seen light in years. Security checkpoints deactivated before their arrival. Doors slid open without a word spoken. Everywhere they passed, soldiers and servants stared. And then they arrived. A tall chamber of black stone and iridescent glass opened before him, and at the far end, seated on a dais beneath a canopy of woven starlight, was the Emperor of Yalarn. Ethan had never seen him in person. He hadn't expected the robes to look so threadbare at the cuffs. Bring him forward, the Emperor said, voice as soft as a lullaby. Ethan approached slowly, painfully aware of the ration-stained tunic he still wore, the weeks of unshaved stubble, the stink of recycled air clinging to him. He dropped to one knee, half out of protocol, half because his legs weren't up to standing anymore. Rise, the Emperor said. Ethan looked up. The ruler of the Yalarn Empire was old, not in the way that meant years, but in the way mountains were old, worn, weathered, and carrying the weight of entire worlds behind his eyes. His gaze was fixed not on Ethan, but on the girl beside him, Princess Alira, who now stood at his side with quiet poise. She laughed, the Emperor said. Not quite to Ethan, not quite to anyone. My daughter laughed. Ethan swallowed. Yes, Your Grace, she did. How? The Emperor's voice cracked. Tell me what you did. Ethan considered the question. I talked. That is all? He nodded. I told stories, jokes. I was alone. She came. She never spoke, but she listened. Every day, and I kept going. I couldn't stop. I think if I had, I would have disappeared. He took a breath. And maybe she would have too. The silence stretched long, broken only when the Emperor stood. His robe fell around him like a wave. You have returned something no healer, no seer, no machine could, he said quietly. Do you understand what that means? Ethan felt too numb to answer. I imprisoned you unjustly, the Emperor went on. You were a teacher, accused by fearful men. I allowed your name to be buried to avoid embarrassment. Ethan blinked. Wait, you knew? I knew the day it happened. His voice was steel now. And I regret it more than any decision I have made. Ethan didn't trust himself to speak. You will be compensated, the Emperor said. We will see to your physical recovery. And if you accept, I would offer you something else. Anything, Ethan murmured, voice hoarse. Be our Minister of Education. Help us rebuild the bridges we burned. Not with machines, not with edicts, with stories. Ethan stared. Your Grace, I'm just a translator. You're the man who made my daughter laugh. That night, he was given a real bed. Doctors came, real ones. Yalarn medics with cool hands and scanning instruments that didn't hum or beep dramatically, just flickered quietly as they checked his vitals, his joints, the muscle loss from weeks of inactivity. One confirmed a light rib bruise, likely from a bad sleeping position on the cell's floor, and mild anemia. Nothing they couldn't treat. You'll need proper meals, sunlight exposure, and joint therapy, one of them told him in surprisingly fluent English. No stairs for a few days. And avoid extended standing until we've rebuilt muscle tone. You've been sedentary for too long. Ethan nodded, grateful, even when they stuck him with a nutrient IV. He barely noticed the med patch applied to his temple to regulate sleep. He slept for nearly 12 hours uninterrupted. When he woke, the room wasn't a cell. It was a guest suite, and, sitting by the window, staring at the stars, was Princess Alira. She turned at the sound of his movement, then walked over slowly. Ethan sat up with effort, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Hey, you're not done with me, are you? She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into the folds of her robe and pulled out a small, square object, a data slate, and held it up. It displayed a crude sketch. A man with wild hair and wide eyes, gesturing dramatically. Next to him, a tiny figure with enormous eyes, expression somewhere between confusion and exasperation. He laughed, a real full laugh. You drew that? She nodded once. Ethan looked at her. Are you okay? After all that? She hesitated, then nodded again. He exhaled. Good. Because I didn't get to finish the story about the diplomat who tried to eat spaghetti with energy tongs. Something changed in her face. Not a laugh, but close. Her shoulders shook once. And, for the first time, she spoke. 2 words. Clear, quiet. Tell me. Ethan's throat closed. I will, he whispered. Outside, the Empire turned on its axis, still too large, still too cruel in places. But for now, in this quiet room above the stars, something small and broken had mended. Ethan Carter was not a man easily stunned anymore. After a month of silent imprisonment, the re-emergence of a mute princess's voice, and an impromptu job offer from the ruler of an interstellar empire, his threshold for surprise had shifted. Dramatically, but nothing quite prepared him for the Ye-Larn Ministry of Education. The building alone could have housed a mid-sized Earth city. It floated above the Capitol spire on a magnetic lattice, its floors stacked like shimmering glass petals, each one rotating slowly to capture solar energy. Inside, however, it was chaos. Elegant bureaucratic chaos. Ye-Larn administrators moved in synchronized clusters, speaking in harmonic triads Ethan barely understood. Files floated mid-air, tagged with hollow markers. Learning pods hummed as children of various species. Ye-Larn, human, Denari. Even 2 Glalok siblings debated historical policies using interactive simulations. It was sleek, efficient, and utterly impersonal. Until now. Ethan stood awkwardly beside an aide as a series of diplomatic robes were thrust at him in succession. None fit. One had 12 sleeves. Another seemed to function as a sound amplifier. Eventually, they settled on simple charcoal robes stitched with the insignia of the ministry, an open circle representing unending curiosity. Someone had the presence of mind to let him keep his old boots. Your first address is scheduled for 2 hours from now, said the aide. A young Ye-Larn, with a face so symmetrical, Ethan had to resist squinting at him. Your topic, narrative empathy in early childhood education. Ethan blinked. I haven't prepared a speech. You'll speak from experience, the aide said, as if that solved anything. And then left. Ethan looked down at the podium in the amphitheater and tried not to panic. Around him, hundreds of eyes glittered in every shade imaginable: ministers, educators, military liaisons, even a few children sitting in the front rows. And among them, at the very center, sat a Lyra. She didn't smile, but she nodded once. Just enough. Ethan exhaled. He stepped forward. I'm not going to start with a quote, he said. His voice still had that hoarseness that came from underuse and too much recycled air. I'm not a philosopher or a poet. I'm a teacher. I taught human children, ages 8 to 12, some of the most terrifying organisms in the galaxy. A ripple of amusement passed through the crowd, encouraging. I've seen smart kids forget how to tie their shoes. I've seen others build functioning AIs out of vending machine parts and chewing gum. But what stuck with me, what always stuck, was how they listened. He paused, looked at the front row. Not to facts, not to rules, to stories. Another pause. You can list protocol violations all day, but if you tell them about the diplomat who clogged the recycling system with chewing bark because he thought it was ceremonial, they remember that. They laugh. They connect. A few of the adults were smiling now. One Ye-Larn elder even shook slightly, suppressing a chuckle. Stories aren't just for entertainment, they're practice, for empathy, for perspective, for survival. He turned toward Alira briefly. Sometimes, they're the only voice that can reach someone who hasn't spoken in 10 years. A silence followed, heavy but not empty. And then, one by one, the chamber stood. It wasn't quite applause. Yalarn didn't do applause. It was closer to a harmonic resonance, each attendee humming a different note in subtle harmony, a cultural gesture of profound respect. Ethan almost choked. Later, in a private meeting chamber shaped like a spiral seashell, the Emperor debriefed him personally. "You've been offered over 40 teaching consultancies since your address," he said, gesturing to a hollow screen filled with flashing proposals. One on a gas giant station, another from a Denari academy. Ethan leaned back, legs aching. "Do they all come with robes this itchy?" "You may choose your assignments," the Emperor said, "but there is one I hope you'll accept." A side panel opened. It revealed a smaller classroom, modest, sunlit, outfitted with cushions instead of desks. In the center sat 6 Yalarn children, each one silent, motionless. "They're trauma patients," the Emperor said softly. "Children of war. Of neglect. They've been unreachable for cycles." Ethan studied the image. "They don't need rules," he said slowly. "They need friction, the unexpected, a reason to want to reach back." The Emperor smiled faintly. "And if I fail?" "You made a princess laugh," the Emperor replied. "Try again." The next 2 weeks became a blur. The medical team stayed on Ethan's case, overseeing his physical rehabilitation meticulously. They tested his blood oxygen every other day, adjusted his nutrient intake to support healthy weight gain, and applied low-impact muscle stimulation to rebuild lost mass. He was banned from lifting anything over 20 pounds, forbidden from running. When he asked if he could do light stretches, one nurse threatened to strap him to the chair. He obeyed. Meanwhile, he began his work at the trauma classroom. The children stared at him like statues at first. He didn't push. He brought small, stupid props, a whoopee cushion from Earth, a hand puppet he stitched together himself using scrap fabric and synth glue. He gave it a name, Professor Plorp, and told the story of how it once accidentally declared war on a fruit bowl. By day 4, 1 child snorted. By day 8, 2 of them were mimicking the puppet voices. By day 12, 1 girl whispered a question. "What happened to the fruit bowl?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned, pointed toward the far window, and gasped dramatically. It escaped, but legend says it's still watching. The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was enough. Alira visited the class once. She didn't announce herself, just stood by the door as Ethan demonstrated to his students how humans use chairs incorrectly. "Sometimes," he said, wobbling on one leg atop the seat, "sitting is a suggestion." A loud thunk followed as he landed flat on his back. 3 kids burst into laughter. One actually doubled over. Ethan groaned, staring at the ceiling. Totally planned. Alira entered quietly and sat beside the others. The students didn't question her. Kids understood grief instinctively, understood how silence could protect and betray all at once. After the lesson, as the others filed out, Alira lingered. "You fell," she said. He rubbed the back of his head. "Technically, I descended with style." A pause. "I used to dream of speaking," she said, "but I thought the dream would vanish if I tried." He met her gaze. "Dreams don't vanish. They wait." Another pause. "I like your stories," she said. Ethan smiled. "Then I guess I'll have to keep telling them." 6 months later, the room looked entirely different. There were no guards outside anymore, no whispered gasps as he passed, and definitely no stale ration packets. The walls had been painted with murals, one drawn entirely by the trauma students, with vibrant chaos only young minds could envision. A squid-like creature was high-fiving a spaceship. A very disproportionate giraffe wore a crown. One entire corner depicted a scene of a tiny princess listening to a man with wild hair flailing over a banana peel. Ethan Carter stood in the center of the room, holding an antique Earth book in one hand and a badly stitched puppet in the other. "And so the squirrel," he declared, looked upon the highway, gazed into the eyes of the oncoming hover truck, and said, "I can make it!" The children shouted in unison, shrieking with laughter. Ethan beamed, and that's how he set a record for the most backflips into a recycling bin. They collapsed in a pile of giggles. Princess Alira, now taller and less shadow than sunlight, stood nearby with a data pad. She wasn't just watching anymore. She was helping. After months of gentle coaxing, she'd begun narrating her own stories first through drawings, then whispers, and eventually aloud. Always with a measured tone, like she was unsure if the sound belonged to her. But it did. Every word she spoke was a reclamation. Today, she waited for the laughter to fade before stepping forward. "Tomorrow," she said clearly, "we start the new exchange series." The room quieted. "Yes," Ethan added, "students from the outer colonies, including humans, will join for a month, to learn from each other, to share cultures." A hand shot up. "Will they know about the hovertruck squirrel?" Ethan grinned. "Only if you tell them." Later that evening, Ethan walked the gardens that lined the upper atrium of the ministry. Real trees from Earth, spliced with native Yalarn flora, bent gently in the artificial breeze. The path curved under soft starlight, where glowing stones lit the way like breadcrumbs through a dream. He paused near the central sculpture, a depiction of a child with arms outstretched toward the sky, made from reclaimed ship metal. Alira joined him silently. She no longer appeared suddenly or moved without sound. She walked like someone used to being noticed. "Tomorrow is a big day," she said. He nodded. "They're going to be nervous." "So was I." He looked at her. "You're allowed to be proud, you know." She didn't reply immediately. Then, "Do you think if I hadn't found your cell?" "I would have told that story to the wall anyway," he said softly. "But I don't think the wall would have laughed." A smile ghosted her lips. "You made me real again," she whispered. He turned to face her fully. "You were always real, Alira. You were just waiting to hear your own voice." They stood in silence a while longer, listening to the hum of distant hovercraft and the faint murmur of music from the festival preparing below. The Empire was changing. Not fast, but deliberately. Across its systems, schools had begun replacing rote programming with narrative immersion. Children debated ethics through myth. Veterans found healing by writing memoirs as fiction. Counselors used stories to reach patients silence had locked away. It wasn't magic. It was human. 2 months later, Ethan sat before the High Council. He wore his simpler robes by choice. His boots were polished, though, and he'd finally trimmed the disaster that had once been his beard. His voice had regained strength. His posture, confidence. The Emperor sat on the central dais, flanked by his ministers. "You've completed the pilot program," the Emperor said, "and the results speak for themselves." Ethan nodded. "I didn't do it alone." "No, but you opened the gate." He gestured to the file in front of him. "The new curriculum, the Empathic Storieway, will become standard across all youth academies within a year. You'll oversee its deployment." Ethan exhaled. "It'll take time. And patience." "We have both," the Emperor replied. "Then we'll need more puppets," Ethan said with a grin. Alira, seated beside the Emperor as a representative for youth advocacy, a role she had insisted on, chuckled softly. The sound drew every eye, not because it was rare anymore, because it was proof. A year later, Earth issued a formal commendation to Ethan Carter for exceptional intercultural contributions. He didn't attend the ceremony. He sent a video recording from a Yalarn classroom instead, where a group of children were reenacting a historical peace treaty as a soap opera. They made him an action figure. It looked nothing like him. The puppet it came with, however, was perfect. On the anniversary of her first spoken words, Alira wrote her own story. It was short, simple. A man fell from the sky into silence. He told stories until silence laughed, and the laugh became a bridge no empire could tear down. She titled it, "The Voice That Waited." She read it aloud during the first Interspecies Youth Symposium. When she finished, no one clapped. They stood, in quiet reverence. Ethan Carter never returned to his old prison cell, but it wasn't sealed off. Instead, it was converted into a listening library. No lights, no noise, just recordings of stories told by children across the stars, echoing softly through the dark. The first recording in the archive? His voice, saying, "I swear, I'm gonna make you laugh today." And then, her laughter. A decade lost to silence, broken by a sound as fragile as it was strong. Hope. Real,